Hi, Phil. Morning, mate. You all right?
How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. You?
Yeah, all good, all good.
How's life inside? Isolated?
Do you know what? It's not been too bad.
Eh?
Like first couple of weeks are actually quite good. I enjoyed it. Spending time with family and stuff like that. This week it's been a little harder because just sort of been able to get, not being able to go out and stuff like that, and even just like social interaction.
Yeah. I see
Um,
you got your clubs out. That's a new one.
Yeah. Oh, well,
Hey?
I'm in my loft, which is like my little private space, and I've got a little putting mat down here, so up here. So I've been doing a bit of putting up here, and a bit of reading, stuff like that. When my missus gives me a break, and I come up here.
I was thinking back, like when I first met you, probably 15, 20 years ago, when
It's longer
when
than
Harold
that.
was around.
Yeah.
And Harold was talking about keeping the face square all the time, and hitting it slightly on the up with it de-lofted and a little bit of acceleration, and I was thinking, right, well, how that's changed from then to now. And I remember how it was in your lifelines, both palms facing one another, almost, and then just almost lead with the handle a little to get the ball rolling.
Yeah.
And I thought, one great question to ask you was, how has it changed since then? Because I mean, you've done a great job taking on the mantle that Harold started, and I thought, well, you see so many variations these days. In your opinion, how has it changed since then? Or has
Um,
it changed more in how they train and things as opposed to the actual technique?
well, there's a couple of different questions there, really. I mean, the only thing I can comment on is obviously from my experience with Harold and how things have changed in that sense. I mean, obviously, I'm 45 now. I first got to know Harold when I was a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, spending time with him. He was one of my dad's best mates. So from when I first started to pick up a club, I was in and around him. He'd help me with my game, short game and even like tee to green stuff, not just putting, because he was a good golfer himself. He qualified for the Portuguese Open one year as an amateur, so he could play
I never
and he
knew
knew the
that.
game. So yeah, so obviously as I got more into got better at golf, spent like a lot of time with him, and obviously fast forward a number of years, I started working with him and appreciating what his approach was. And I would say, like, you're going back like 20, 17, 18 years, which is a long time in golf, isn't it? Technology's changed an awful lot. But there's a couple of things here. Harold was ahead of his time in many different ways, but he also taught a method, a specific method. Now, in terms of how he was ahead of his time, he was ahead of his time in many ways, because like before you had like detailed launch monitors and this, that and the other, where you could really analyze the spin and launch of the ball. He was theorizing what was happening, and he was pretty accurate about it. He was kind of teaching ball flight laws for putting many years ago. And so as a consequence, because of those principles of impact and his engineering background, he came about to sort of develop a particular method which he felt was optimum in terms of achieving like good launch conditions, good roll, stuff like that. So, he wasn't a golf coach. He didn't come from a coaching background or a biomechanics or physiology background or anything like that, skill acquisition background. He came from an engineering background. He was a designer of, engineering equipment. He had a passion for golf. He started designing, golf equipment, and then he started theorizing about, well, how should you strike the putt, and what are the things involved, and how do you limit certain aspects of motion. So then he kind of theorized around, well, what would the mechanics of that stroke look like? But if you look at his principles, he called them the four fundamentals. You know, if you look at those, they still hold the test of time. You know, face angle being paramount to starting direction, interaction of loft and rise angle. You know, in terms of in terms of launch and spin. You know, acceleration, controlling velocity. You know, rhythm and timing. He was always, you know, he had an understanding of some of those components. And he appreciated, like, green reading. He had the sort of theory that every putt was a straight putt. It was the pace that you hit it, and you know, and stuff that would determine the break. And so that was his way of like theorizing, talking about green reading. And I wouldn't necessarily sort of agree that every putt's a straight putt, because conceptually, the shapes of putts can influence people in different ways. But you know, like 20 years ago, there weren't many people thinking along those lines. And
No, very true.
you know,
He was probably one of the only ones at that moment in time as well.
I think over here, yeah,
like,
in Europe, yeah, certainly.
yeah.
You know, obviously, I think like Dave Peltz, you know, his career stems back, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
you know, and some of the things that like Peltz was speaking about 20 years ago, people wouldn't say have held the test of time. But you know, Dave, you can't say that Dave isn't a pioneer in what he's done and how he.
Absolutely.
The attention that he brought to that part of the game, and you know, like coaching, the importance of putting stuff like that. When I read the Pelt stuff when I was a kid, like, you know, I drew loads of things out of it that would have helped me. There's some things that probably hurt, but you know, that's the evolution of coaching, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, if I went back to some of my early lessons, I'm probably due to give a few people a few quid back. But you know, everyone evolves, and theories and stuff like that. You know, evolve, you know, with it. So, but yeah, Harold had a particular sort of method. You know, one way to grip it, one way to set up to it, and
well, that's obviously changed massively, hasn't it?
I think so. Yeah,
I mean, I remember going back when I was sort of 17, 18 and contracted this disease called the yips, where you physically couldn't move, right? And trying to find a way of holding the putter to do it. And at that time, there was only one way to hold the putter. Now, there's there isn't a way to hold the putter, is there?
No, and I think that's where we've got better as coaches, isn't it? Where the information we have available now, I think, like, you know, the knowledge that we have as coaches, you know, as an industry is better, so we can more understanding about skill acquisition, individual dynamics, and how that can influence things, you know, physiology, all those things, which really help us sort of teach the individual, teach the person. I mean, I think all coaches will have certain preferences or principles, you know, and then, you know, we might approach. I'd like to think that most of us will then approach the individual differently to try and achieve what the important things. So I think that aspect's changed. I would say, like, for me, that's been the biggest, like, learning curve for me, is when I entered coaching. You know, I taught a method which was Harold's method.
Yeah.
You know, and if I hadn't have done it, I would have got the sack. You know, but but then, you know, over time, like, you know, Harold kind of gave me the room to develop and stuff like that, and I introduced my own ideas and thoughts, and you know, he would challenge me and stuff, but you know, I think when there was always logic applied to stuff, he you know, he'd let me run with it, and then so you know, and experience is a great thing, isn't it? When you're working with different players,
Oh yeah,
you start to see how people do it differently, don't you? So you kind of end up growing and learning.
The one thing always, Phil, I've always took from you from the very early days when some of the county players used to come up to the place up at Harold's place at Thornby.
Yeah.
Even to now, where I've been out and about and seen you on putting green, is you're almost like a surgeon who just gives them the little bit they need.
Gynecologist.
You know, so that then they can, and then give them such great training ways of training and practicing to improve their performance in the game. You know, I never, and this is a personal, I've never seen you where you look like you're taking somebody to pieces. You know what I mean? I always think you're very refined in what you do. You create the little changes that make the biggest difference to the player, and then prove it with whatever technology you have. And at that moment in time, it was Sam Putt Labs, and obviously it's changed to many variations now, hasn't it? There's so much available
Yeah.
to us to be able to evaluate players.
I think that's putting though, isn't it? It's a slightly different, well, it's a very different part of the game. You know, it's quite a fine motor skill, isn't it? Particularly if you compare it to sort of hitting a driver. So very often it's small refinements of technique. And also I think with putting, you've got like a bigger skill set in a way and it's not just always about technique. So often with players, you know, there are very small refinements. It'd be more about how they acquire the other skills. So, you know, sometimes you could look at a player and think like, well, he's not really changed much there, which, but they could be putting better through smaller refinements or different changes in strategies or processes. But then other times you have to make big changes with players. But then I think if you can do that well, you know, you change the right things and you set plans and processes in place where they can acquire those new techniques quickly. The player can actually look comfortable in that. You know, like some of my friends full swing coaches, and I see some of the stuff that they do, and you think, well, that's massively different from what, but like it looks like they've acquired that quite easily. So, to my untrained eye. But I think with putting, you know, there's so many different, it's such a fine motor skill, so many different ways to go about it. You have to be a little bit more refined I think, in your approach, and you certainly got to embrace other skill sets and technique.
Yeah, and you know what, the part of it is obviously changing the technique or the basic piece, whether it be something in the setup or the positioning of the body. But then the other side of that becomes how they then advance that skill to become a good putter, and you know that's a skill in itself. And I remember, I'm sure I saw a quote from, and quote me with this, but I'm sure it's Justin Rose say that, you know, what Phil Kenyon had brought to the party was not just a change in technique to make me a better putter, but he'd give me some principles and some training or some practice drills for me to become a better putter long term. And that sort of struck me, because I thought to myself, you know what, you give someone a basic change, but it's what you've then given them to go and do that ultimately could make them a better putter. So I mean, you know, you must now do so much more than just putt relative to their ability to go and play and be successful in the game.
I think that just goes back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, appreciating the other skill sets beyond technique. You know, how you transfer those skills as well to the golf course. So how you structure your practice to not just develop, you know, temporary confidence, but to acquire skill.
How do you do that, Phil? How do you try and do that? How do you try and help them develop skills as opposed to confidence?
Well, I think, so one of the things like with Rosie, when I first started with him, you know, he was very much like a tinker of technique. Mike Walker, do you ever make people a better version of themselves? He's taking the piss there, isn't he? Mike, have you not got something better to do? Go and take your dog for a walk. It's made me laugh, that. So Rosie was a bit of a tinkerer, and spent a lot of time sort of fiddling in and around his technique, and I don't think necessarily like would practice some of the other parts of putting and get the relevant feedback, you know. So I think to get better at anything, you need some element of feedback. So like, I'll give you a common failing that I would see with players. You know, everyone knows you've got sort of three simple skills. You've got start the ball on line, read the green, and control speed. And people are pretty good at getting feedback on start line and speed control. They can do various drills that give them feedback so that they can assess, am I getting better at that? You know, what do I need to refine further? But I don't see many players get really good feedback in terms of their ability to predict break. You know, so like, you know, constructing your practice so that you can challenge yourself to do something, get some feedback, refine, move on, try and do it better, bit of feedback, refine, move on, try and get better. So like in each of those three areas, I think you need like relevant amounts of feedback to, you know, to help you refine your strategy. And then in practice, you need to be able to go and perform with it. You know, actually put it under the pump a little bit to see if it works. Then you're practicing, you know, the process that's ultimately what you're trying to take out on the golf course in a very refined, playable like way. So like that's where I think the structure of your practice is important. And I would say, you know, at times, like even like the best players in the world, they don't have the most efficient ways of practicing. They're just really good at what they do. So on certain days, they'll just go out and they, you know, it's there and they can do it. But then other times, it's not there. So even just like helping a player and how they structure their practice can have you know, a lot of benefit for them in terms of like tapping into their potential, raising their level of consistency through just transferring skills better.
And how would you go about? I mean, if we say, I don't think you're wrong here at all, that most players don't actually bring green reading into their putting practice. Certainly, you know, we've got two greens at the golf course. One's flat at the top, and one in front's sloped like on the golf course. And invariably, most people practice on the top green when it's flat.
Yeah.
From 3 foot.
Yeah.
With 10 balls. You know what I mean? There's probably very few who actually use the bottom green to actually green. And when you look at green reading, are you then assessing that using your little gates that you invented to help them be able to hit the ball on the line they want?
Yeah, I mean that could be like one drill that they could use to help them like build a picture of the putt, and then the start line is one part of that picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then you know, if you're using like a gate, they've got to then hit it through that gate, and then they're going to get feedback on the read, they're going to get feedback on speed, they're going to get feedback on their start line.
Because I always find with a lot of players that they would look at the putt and decide what the break was, set themselves up, and then almost the moment they're over it, try and do something else, almost second guess themselves. Oh, I've not allowed enough break here, or too much. So the stroke never mirrors the initial intention of the line. You know what I mean?
I think there's a few things going on in scenarios like that, and someone asked the question on here before, how does the shape of the putt affect stroke dynamics? Well, you know, certain putts, you know, generally players have patterns. You could have like pull bias, push bias, certain things that they do in the stroke. And invariably, that doesn't change an awful lot. That pattern will be fairly robust. It will be stressed differently on certain putts. So like if you've got a particular pull bias, you know, you get onto a left or right putt, it's going to be a lot easier for that pull bias to sort of show up, you know, as you react to the slope, or if you know, over time, you tend to underread putts, you know, to match that pull bias, then that pull bias becomes more prevalent on a certain putt type. Right to left putt, you know, you could be working up that slope more, trying, you know, intuitive, trying to hold it off to fight that slope. So it might not be as prevalent, you know, but the stroke might not be as consistent then on the right to left. But ultimately, you can still work it down to some sort of pull bias that's created from a closed club face at some point. But like you've got scenarios like that where, you know, certain you know, player can have a conscious read, so they read it consciously in their mind's eye what the putt's going to do, and then when you step in, you know, you've got an intuitive sense or feel, haven't you, over the ball?
Yeah.
Everybody has that. If you've ever used a line on the ball, you've stepped in and thought, shit, that doesn't look right, feel right.
I think that's really interesting as well, because you know, the eyes are a massive part of this, aren't they? You know.
Yeah, but I mean, let's take the eyes out of it, and let's say like there's no perceptual imbalance as to where that line
Yeah.
looks. You've just got an intuitive
Yeah.
sense that something's not right. So you've got a feel involved as to where you need to start that ball. Now, that could be influenced by your stroke tendencies. Okay, that could be influenced by patterns of under reading, and then, you know, your athletic sense of where that ball needs to go. So there's a lot of things that are involved into why things like that happen with any given player, that I think, like, the advanced part of putting coaching is being able to delve into those for any player and work out the nuances, and then work out what they need to do to manage those patterns, manage those feelings, and, you know, refine the routines and approaches in general. Because you're talking, you know, there's, if you can, you know, small margins in each of those areas in terms of understanding, actually, you know, your net effect, it can be massive, can't it?
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
there's loads of little aspects like that which are not, they're not technical.